Mixing audio stories, whether it's podcasts, news pieces, or narratives, can be super tedious and frustrating. The key to fend off that frustration is to use an efficient workflow. So where do you get an efficient workflow? Well, it just so happens that audio engineers are the masters of mixing. So I'm going to walk you through the steps an audio engineer would use to mix a typical audio story. Before we start, I want to make 3 key points. First, the audio won't make any sense. I Frankensteined a piece together just to demonstrate specific techniques. If you're expecting a good story, you will be disappointed. Second, these techniques can apply to any audio software. I happen to be using Pro Tools, but you can use this guide with any audio software you like. Finally, trust your ears. You may not feel confident about these tools at first, but if your ears tell you it sounds better, it probably does, so go with it. Our first step is to organize. Here we see a typical layup, and there are a few things I want to change about this right away. First, I want to name these tracks. Audio 1, Audio 2, that means nothing to me. Second, I want to get each voice on its own track. I don't want 2 different people on the same track. And finally, I want to organize these clips so they're a little easier to look at. Okay, so now I've made some new tracks and I've named them, and each voice is now on its own track. That's really important when we start applying EQ later. Now we'll arrange these tracks so they fall in the following order: host-reporter tracks, actualities and guests, ambience and room tone, followed by music, and finally a master track. I'm also going to cascade these clips so they flow nicely from top to bottom, left to right. That makes things easier to look at and easier to navigate. In a big session with a lot of clips, this is a huge time saver. Now I'm going to rough in levels. Note that we're using a master track here at the bottom. All of the other tracks in my session flow through this master track. That's where we put a loudness meter to measure everything combined. We're measuring the overall loudness of the mix. Now, all I'm going to do for this step is take a few seconds to adjust the overall level of each track so they're close to the mixing target on my meter. In this case, I'm aiming for -24.
Originally, non-compete clauses were used for executives and for people in high-tech.
I'm just making very rough adjustments to get the tracks close. And in this case, the host is low, so I'll bump it up a bit.
Originally, non-compete clauses were used for executives and for people in high-tech positions, where companies wanted to protect intellectual property or trade secret.
Now I'm going to do the same thing for each act. Remember, this is just a rough ballpark, so don't get too picky. I'm also not going to worry about ambience or music at this point, just the voices. Now, with everything at a consistent level, I'm going to ask whether I need to use EQ to fix a tonal problem. To do that, I'm going to listen to each track and describe it with an adjective. My adjectives might be boomy or bassy, nasally or pinched, shrill or tinny, harsh or sibilant. And that adjective will tell us what frequencies to adjust with the EQ. I already know my host track is good, so let's start with the first actuality called Dave.
Back at Tahoe, surfer Ivy Miller is just coming out of the water after spending several hours out there with her friends.
In this case, Dave sounds boomy or bassy. Remember, trust your adjectives, trust your ears. Because I said this was boomy or bassy, that tells me we need to remove low frequencies. A high-pass filter is a great way to do that. So I'm going to open an EQ plugin, and I'm going to find the feature called high pass or low cut. It's called that because it lets the high frequencies pass and cuts out the lows. I'm simply going to move the frequency selector up from left to right until it sounds better. It's as simple as that.
Back at Tahoe, surfer Ivy Miller is just coming out of the water after spending several hours out there with her friends. She grew up in Southern California, where surfing means sun and sand.
We've landed at 120 hertz, and that's pretty high. Usually we don't go any higher than about 100 hertz, 110 hertz. But in this case, it works, so I'm going to trust my ears and move on. Now, your plugin might look different from mine, but the options will be the same. We'll repeat this step for every track, deciding whether or not to EQ. So let's move on to Stefan.
He understands that, his voice can suck a lot of oxygen out of the room and that he needs to give space.
Now, I think Stefan sounds harsh and sibilant, and that tells me it's a high-frequency problem. So I'm going to open my plugin, I'm going to increase the gain knob in one of the frequency bands, and I'm going to sweep from the low end on the left to the high end on the right until the problem jumps out at me and gets louder.
He understands that, his voice can suck a lot of oxygen out of the room and that he needs to give space to the next generation of progressive leadership to take the reins of the party and move it along.
Now, once I find that spot, I'm going to reduce the gain to reduce the level of those offending frequencies. Listen again.
He understands that, his voice can suck a lot of oxygen out of the room and that he needs to give space to the
Now,
next
sometimes it's easy to get lost in your work. The bypass button is a great tool to turn off the plugin and compare. Ask yourself, are you making things
out of
better?
the room, and that he needs to give space to the next generation of progressive leadership to take the reins of the party and move it along.
It's worth noting that for this particular example, a tool called a de-esser would be appropriate to use. If you have one of those and you know how to use it, go for it. So let's move on to Sarah.
It's not easy, so it's hard, even though they might be curious.
Now, this track has some low-end rumble from wind, so a high pass will work.
It's not easy, so it's hard, even though they might be curious about it. I tell them it's not all. It's not easy, so it's hard, even though they might be curious about it. I tell them.
Again, we've ended up with a high pass set pretty high, but it does sound better, so I'm going to trust my ears. It's important to note here that Sarah has corresponding ambi, and we need to make sure the ambi sounds the same as the voice. So we always do the same fix on both the voice and its corresponding ambi. Finally, there's Craig on the phone. Let's listen.
And, it comes out as a very interesting list. Concentration in New York and Pennsylvania.
Now that sounds really noisy and hissy, but there's a great trick when you're working with phone tape that always works. There's a caveat though, it only works for traditional phone calls. Not Skype, not FaceTime, not Google Voice, traditional phone calls. Set a high pass at 200 hertz and a low pass at 3500 hertz. Change the slope of the filter to make it steeper, 18 or 24 dB an octave. And let's listen.
And, it comes out as a very interesting list. Concentration in
Let's compare with a bypass.
Pennsylvania, but also there's other companies out there that have a number of leaks in Texas.
The noise is gone. Now, if we like, we can adjust these frequencies slightly, but in general, 200 and 3500 hertz will get you exactly what you need. In this step, we'll determine if we need to use compression. Ask yourself these questions. Does the person speak in an even and consistent way? Do they sound strong and present? And if you turn the listening level down about halfway, can you still hear and understand every word? If you answer no, compression might help. Now, compression is easily overused, so feel free to skip this step if you don't feel comfortable or have a hard time hearing the results. Open a compressor plugin on the track. Set the ratio knob to 1.5 to 1, a setting appropriate for natural sounding dialogue. Set the attack knob to 11 milliseconds. Set the release knob to 100 milliseconds. These are general guidelines that will give you decent results most of the time. Now, hit play and lower the threshold knob until the gain reduction meter consistently shows 2 to 3 dB of reduction on most words.
Oxygen out of the room, and that he needs to give space to the next generation of progressive leadership to take the reins of the party and move it along in the right direction.
Every voice will need a different threshold. If the level is dropped a little, you can use the gain knob to raise the level slightly. Now listen to the fix and compare it to the original using the bypass button. Now it's time to check each edit and fade. You can quickly do this by using the key command in your audio software that jumps you from one edit to the next. Jump to that first edit, listen to it, and ask yourself, is the edit noticeable? If it is, adjust.
Where companies wanted to protect intellectual property or trade.
I don't hear this particular edit, so I'll move on to the next one. And I'm going to repeat this for every edit in my piece. Next, we'll make sure there's a fade at the top and tail of every clip. That helps prevent the sound of abrupt shifts in room tone or ambi. Jump to the beginning and end of each clip and make sure there's a fade. Continue checking throughout the rest of the piece. Now we'll fine-tune the levels. The key here is to mix in sentences and phrases. Don't let yourself get drawn into making tiny adjustments to words and syllables. Stick to sentences and phrases. To do that, keep yourself zoomed out a ways. If you zoom in, it's too easy to get caught up in making tiny changes, and that gets frustrating. Starting from the top track to the bottom track, adjust each track individually. Draw in level automation on the first track to get it to the target level on the meter. Do it clip by clip. Once you're done with the host track, balance the clips on the next one. But the cool thing is, you now have the host to use as an anchor. Because the host is hitting the right target, you can compare all of the other tracks to the host track. You just built the foundation for the whole mix with the host track. We haven't really touched the ambience or music tracks yet, and they can be tricky to get just right. Too hot, they'll be distracting. Too low, and they won't be audible in louder listening environments like the car or the subway. To get things just right, use what we call the rock and roll mixing trick. Audio engineers use this trick all the time to evaluate the balance of instruments in a music mix. Turn the listening level of your headphones down about halfway and listen to the balance of the voice and music.
And, it comes out as a very interesting list. Concentrations in New York and Pennsylvania, but also there's other companies out there that have a number of leaks in Texas or Virginia.
WeWork is not alone in attracting regulatory.
If something disappears or sticks out, you know you need to make an adjustment. This trick works on both headphones and speakers, so you should try it on both. Finally, it's time to listen to your mix from beginning to end at a comfortable level. Concentrate on what you're hearing, don't let yourself get distracted, and pay particular attention to the transitions. That's where your audience will notice differences the most. If you're happy with what you hear, congratulations, you are finished. Here are those steps all in one place. Organize, roughen levels, decide if you need to EQ, decide if you need compression, check your edits and fades, fine-tune levels, balance ambience and music, and listen to the mix. Check out more storytelling resources at npr.org/training and on Twitter @NPR Training. I'm Rob Byers with Minnesota Public Radio, and you can find me at Rob Byers1. Happy mixing.